Okay, great. So we're at 1 minute after starting time. So we only have about half an hour today. So we might as well get started. So I thought, I guess for people joining us for the first time, my name is Matt Post. I'm from Johns Hopkins, and I'm moderating this panel today among these open source toolkits with Huda Kerala, who's also at JHU. And maybe we'll go around and everybody just take 30 seconds to introduce yourselves by toolkit. I guess we'll go in the same order that we presented. So we'll start with Open NMT folks.
Yeah, okay, let's get started. So I'm Guillaume, I'm working on OpenMT and also at Cistern. So we started OpenMT like 4 years ago. And during all this time, working on that and making sure that the project continue to evolve.
So I'm François. I'm also working on the OpenMT project, and I'm based in France in the Ubicus, which is a language service provider. I started working on OpenMT in 2017, mostly on the PyTorch version.
Okay, great. So I guess we'll go to Sakai next.
Yeah, so I'm Toby from Amazon, one of the Sakai developers, and yeah, working on Amazon Translate, a translation service from AWS.
Okay, and I think we have two panelists, UMT. I just see, well, actually, Kenneth, I guess we should go to Kenneth too, because he's also part of representing Sakai to some extent, or do you have a foot into?
Sure. Hi, I'm Kenneth Hayfield from the University of Edinburgh, and also Efficient Translation Limited, if you read the asterisk in the paper. So I wouldn't describe myself as the lead of either Marian or Sakai, but a contributor to both. And at Edinburgh, we're heavily involved in Marian, but I also optimize some stuff for Sakai.
Okay, great. Welcome, Kenneth. And then we have the the THUMT folks. I don't know if we've lost them or just their videos off. Does Gang or Shuo, are you? Oh, yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gang Chen from Tsinghua University. I'm one of the developers of THUMT. It's a great pleasure to take part in this panel and have the opportunity to discuss the development of NMT toolkits.
Okay, and is Shuo here as well, or has he checked off?
Hello.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm Shuo. I'm one of the developers in the team of THMT, and I have worked on THMT for about 2 years. I'm very glad to be here to discuss with you about the development of NMT toolkits. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so to get us started, I have sort of a light question, and I'm just curious. It's often hard to get the story behind toolkits names. So if everybody could tell us, is there any particular reasoning or origin story behind the toolkit's name and the toolkit itself? I guess if there's something interesting worth saying, it's potentially there's nothing worth saying, but if there is, I'd be curious to hear it. And maybe we'll start, I guess we can start with OpenNMT and go through the same order.
Yes, so as you can see, OpenNMT, the name is not very original. I guess in 2016, it was the easy choice because we were kind of the first big toolkit. I mean, I think there was already Nematus out there. So it was easy for us to choose OpenNMT. It was clear what it was about, so we chose that.
Yeah,
so there's no closed NMT that it replaced?
Say again?
There's no closed NMT that preceded OpenNMT?
No.
No, okay. So Toby, sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so I think maybe Sockeye is most obvious name for Toolkit to be named Sockeye. And the background story there is basically back in also 2017, we were trying to find a name when open sourcing the Toolkit. We were kind of wondering what we should name it. We happened to be in Seattle at that time for an Amazon conference and sitting in a restaurant looking at the menu, and one of the items was Sockeye salmon. And so that's how it ended up on the list of candidates for a name. And we thought Sockeye salmon and Seattle having some kind of connection to Amazon also made sense. So that's why we picked something rather unique.
Yeah, certainly makes searching for it interesting, I think. Many people have experienced this. And I guess we'll move on to open, or sorry, I keep calling it open, THUMT.
Okay. The name of THUMT is composed of two parts, THU and MT. THU stands for the Tsinghua University, and because THUMT is developed by the Nature Language Groups of Tsinghua University. And MT is the machine translation because this is open source toolkit to development the machine translation. We got to that's all.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. Okay. So I think the next question is more focused on.
Hey.
You want to talk about Marion? Okay.
I need to make fun of Martin for having 3 characters of overlap at the beginning of his name with the name of the toolkit. Not that I would ever do such a thing. And Amun started out called Adam Mickiewicz University, and actually a lot of the work was done in Edinburgh. Then all of the Polish people left Adam Mickiewicz University, and there was some comments about how Edinburgh couldn't get any funding because it was named after another university. So it's actually now named after a Polish cryptographer, Marian Rajewski. I apologize to all the Polish people for botching the pronunciation of that name, but also the 3-character overlap with Marcin.
Okay, a well-established, I think, habit in the open source community, reaching back at least to Minix, right? Linux. Okay. All right, now I'll move on to the next question. So this is maybe one that's more focused on production or toolkits that are in use by companies, so less on the academic side. But I'm interested if anybody should feel free to comment here, but I'm interested to hear comments on this sort of tension between research and production. So on the one hand, it seems like OpenNMT has sort of solved this problem or addresses it by having actual separate code bases, one focused on speed, the other maybe flexibility. Amazon has a single toolkit, although I'm not sure what, I guess Toby didn't say much about the production side, but if you can comment on what the fundamental tensions are, and is this a problem at all, or is it not really a problem? To what degree does having to focus on production drive research questions or get in the way of the kind of flexibility you need to do more core research in machine translation? So I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer to go first, or I can call on somebody.
Yeah, I can start if you want. About OpenNMT. So it's true that we have 2 separate code bases, and it's true also that the initial idea was to have something for research and something for production. But actually, at the end, both can be considered good for research and good for production. And I think it's the natural evolution of NMT toolkits. I think that's my impression, at least. Maybe Francois, do you have something more on that?
Oh, Francois, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. No, I basically agree with Guillaume because at the beginning, the PyTorch version was really more like an experiment. But as the development went on, it became production ready. And the sign of that is that we offer a standalone server that you can use to infer to provide inference from models. And we at Ubicus use the PyTorch version in production, and I've been using it for more than 2 years now, and it scales nicely and it works fine. So I think it's fairly easy to separate the research work to the production work, I think, because you can fiddle with the code and train some models, etc. But it won't have much impact on the production side. At least if you keep the base architecture and the base bricks of your code, if it does not move, there's not much tension. Where there can be tension is somewhere that Guillaume said when talking about Translate 2 earlier, is if we have some big change in architecture or some new models or some new paradigm, then it might cause some issue. But it's as it is now in the current situation, there's not much tension, I think, between research and production.
So that's interesting. So if you're using both of these toolkits for production, doesn't that sort of split your effort, since both of them take time to maintain?
It's a question of choice, because we at Ubicus are more focused on the PyTorch version, but Guillaume at Sistra and his team, they are more focused on using the TensorFlow version. And I think it's a question of taste, maybe at this point.
I see.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, for us, for Sockeye, I think we're pretty happy with just having a single version that we use for both experiments and for production. I think in terms of attention, I wouldn't say there's too much tension. I think maybe if the risk is that it's too rigid, that it's hard to make changes, I think, of course, yeah, that it needs to be easy. But I think as long as you have some kind of setup where you can make changes to your toolkit and run experiments without affecting production directly, so maybe create a branch and run experiments with that, and don't touch production, I think you're set up for running experiments and you should be fine. And I think the main challenge is then merging things back. And at that point, you want to be doing proper integration. But if you have such a setup, I think it's perfectly fine to have just a single code base.
A tool that trains quickly is the best tool for research often.
Oh, that trains quickly.
Yes, otherwise you have PhD students idling.
I see. Sure, that's a good point. Is that I mean, I from my perspective, I tend to think of it being much easier to develop in Python with an imperative backend for a deep learning toolkit. But I suppose there could be some advantages to working with C++ on the back end if you reduce the amount of time you have to spend waiting for models to train and so on.
So I think maybe one advantage of having basically kind of a production framework, which I guess applies to all the toolkits, is that, I mean, I guess generally you want to document your code pretty well. And I think some of the repositories that you see sometimes that come with papers aren't always very well documented. And I think having that constraint that you need to document your code can make the code actually more readable than maybe some cryptic repositories, which, yeah, doesn't apply, I guess, to any of the toolkits, but might apply to other code bases.
Certainly nobody here is guilty of under-documentation. Yeah, okay. I mean, so in general, the documentation issue is a nice one because it's, I mean, how do you view documentation in general? Is it a service to the community or a draw to people who might use your toolkit, or more a service to yourself,
I think
future version of yourself?
It's kind of all. I have a recent experience about this because I rewrote a lot of the documentation for the 2.0 release of OpenMTPy, and it's quite helpful actually to go over the documentation and all the examples and all the scripts, etc. Because you might find some issues or questions you didn't tackle yet, and it's quite useful, and it's also very helpful in kind of handling the community, because when a lot of issues arise and often the same questions, you can point towards a specific part of the documentation, and it makes the administration job much easier.
I think documentation is very powerful in the sense that if you have an example system that runs English, German for WMT 14 and has a bad BLEU score, then there will be endless papers that run on that language pair with a bad BLEU score, to the point that all tests on WMT 14 English, German are worthless now. So actually, it's important to get the documentation right and have the best practices in it, because a lot of people will want to start from an example of a baseline system, go and implement their research thing, and use that as the baseline. So it's important to set a good baseline in your documentation.
Yeah, okay, so you might think of that as the time to be up and running for a random machine translation researcher on your toolkit.
That's an important use case, and there's two users really. There's the production person who just wants to train a model and run it and doesn't care about modifying the structure of the model, maybe wants to parameterize it. And I think Marian covers that user well. Less well is the I want to go in and modify the guts of how this transformer head works.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so another question I'm curious to hear from these different toolkits. So there's, I mean, in a lot of senses, it's a really different world from when I started out as a PhD student a long time ago, and even so, let's say 20 years ago, when there weren't a lot of toolkits and it wasn't easy to share software and so on. So, but I wonder if we've gone in the other direction. So now basically every lab or group or so on, for the most part, I mean, a lot of them have their own toolkits. So is this a good thing or a bad thing? Is there wasted effort in all this duplication? Would it be better to download one of these toolkits and start? Maybe another way to ask this is, say I want to do some machine translation research. What do I gain from building my own toolkit in my lab versus downloading Sakai or Open NMT or THUMT and making contributions there? So is there some way to make that decision, or not really? Is it? I think this is a question that people face as a researcher, is like, there's so many choices out there. It's just not clear. You know, there's a lot of work involved in even just evaluating them and then figuring out which magic setting you need for the different toolkits and how they actually, you know, which exact features they have and how they compare and so on. So what advice do you have for, you know, a master's level or PhD student who is faced with this decision or this question?
I think in terms of magic settings, using a toolkit takes that a bit away, right? If you implement your own toolkit or your own transformers, then you need to figure out a lot of kind of the like magic and the special settings that everybody has come up with the right learning rate and maybe other settings. Whereas if you use a tool and maybe a recipe or some documented version of how to train a baseline model, then I think it's easier to get started, right, and get a good baseline score rather than implementing something on your own. But I think at the same time, as a student, I think I would definitely recommend also implementing basic models from scratch, because I think there's no better way of learning a model than implementing it. And I think for the background story of Sakai, this is also how Sakai was started. Initially, like a couple of years back, we wanted to learn more about NMT. So we just sat down, we opened a Jupyter notebook and started implementing some translation models. And then we trained our first models. They got decent blue scores, and to our surprise, and then we moved on and made a package and grew it into a toolkit. So I think for educational purposes, definitely it's a good idea to implement, because there's many things that are not necessarily even documented in the paper, so you don't even think about if you just read the paper, that you need to think about when you implement something.
So one of the questions we have from the audience is asking kind of two related questions, which are open to all the panelists. One is unique about your toolkit compared to all of the others, and kind of on a different end, what is missing from all toolkits, including yours, from your perspective? If anyone wants to answer that.
I'll say that our main value proposition for Marian is it has few dependencies and it runs fast for training and inference. And this makes it useful to a lot of companies who want to train their own models and run them in production out of the box. To answer the second question, I think all toolkits are missing the second part of building an MT system, which is actually quite hard and, for better or worse, often black magic, which is I've got a parallel corpus for some random language I've never worked with before. How should I build a model with that reasonably?
Are you saying from a do you think this is a contribution that should be made by the toolkit, or do you think this is an open research question?
It's weird for me to say this, but I think a lot of companies that have Google Translate or AWS Translate have built up a code base internally that's perhaps their secret sauce, their recipe for building systems across a wide variety of language pairs. Is that something that should be in a toolkit? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the toolkit should just be the thing that takes the parameters and trains. But there isn't that sort of thing out in the open.
So I think your first statement was vague. To rephrase it, are you suggesting that there should be better hyperparameter search for NMT systems, or are you talking about something different?
I would agree that we need better hyperparameter search, but even just reasonable hyperparameters for a wide variety of language pairs is missing.
I think the issue of the wide variety of language and language pairs is also that it's not only hyperparameters. You have other questions like tokenization, like you may have some romanization steps. You have a lot of issues that you can't necessarily embed in a toolkit as is. But it's a very important question, I agree. But there is no magic recipe, I think. It really depends on the language.
It does raise an interesting point, though, is that there is a lot of work in releasing the code for the core engines of these MT systems, but maybe less so in sort of standardizing input formats and things of this sort. But maybe there are fewer conventions around around the whole pipeline. And I know different sites will have different recipes and so on, but I'd say more of a Wild West than even using the toolkits themselves, which, as diverse as they are, also have a lot of the same core components in terms of deep libraries and so on. But I know there are options with Sakai and Marion, right? At least these are ones I'm familiar with, where there's recipes for how to build a decent WMT19 English-German model, for example.
Yeah, we have a recipe for, in Marian examples, for building a few models. I'm just saying that's like, here's 2 language pairs, and it's not at the same scale as if everyone in WMT had to submit not only their system outputs, but a shell script that started from the original training data. And maybe that's not a toolkit discussion at all, but a larger everything for MT. But that's my answer to what's not in any of the toolkits.
Yeah, okay.
Wasn't there some kind of project, I think embedded in the Hugging Face repository with a lot of language pairs? I don't recall, I don't know if any of you guys recall of this.
Yeah, I like what Hugging Face did. They trained a bunch of transformers. Actually, it started with the Opus people on all of the data from Opus. And that's a start. It's basically mass build translation systems from this data. And then all of the sauce that goes in to build the WMT system, which is expensive, I don't think is in the Hugging Face stuff.
I thought there were a few specific recipes in there, but maybe not.
So from the chat, there's a couple things to wrap up on. One is a quick call out to Joey NMT, which is a toolkit for educational purposes that people in the audience might be interested in. And maybe a way to wrap up the panel might be to talk about evaluation. So we have a question that states that there's this pretty strong focus on using BLEU to assess quality in most toolkits. And the question notes that BLEU scores have been shown to have limitations, perhaps even be useless. And so the question asks, what kind of evaluation metrics have you built into your toolkit, and which are you planning to implement and or improve?
I mean, from the Sakai perspective, we haven't built any evaluation metrics into the toolkit. So I think we stop at the translation, and then what you use. I think if you use BLEU, you should definitely use Sakai BLEU. That's for sure, to standardize the evaluation at least. Of course, it's much better to do human evaluations, but it's also costly. So there's a trade-off. And I think we're still going to be stuck with some automatic metrics for the better or worse.
Yeah, for OpenNMT, we usually provide a BLEU scoring, but of course, we recommend people to use other things if it makes sense to them.
Yeah, okay. I think we're basically out of time. A short panel discussion, but I appreciate everybody showing up today and participating. And thanks also for your presentations today. And I don't know, am I forgetting anything here, Huda, that we should mention before we close? Yep, okay, great. Well, let's, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say that there's been an ongoing note to check the AMTA announcements, which we will repaste in the chat.
Okay. All right, let's thank our panelists. Picture an audience clapping. This is just too weird, all the silence. Really nice to see everybody in some form. I wish we were in Orlando, but thanks for participating, and I'll see you in the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.